82-year-old Margaret Johnson's hands were trembling as she held the Michael Jackson concert tickets her granddaughter Lisa had given her. Parkinson's disease had been weakening her more each day, but this tremor was different. This was excitement trembling. What happened next at Madison Square Garden would prove that some moments are worth fighting for, no matter how frail your body becomes. Margaret Johnson had always been stubborn. Even at 82, confined to a wheelchair since her Parkinson's diagnosis 6 months earlier, she refused to let her condition define her. When 16-year-old Lisa burst into their small Queens apartment that Tuesday afternoon, waving 2 front-row tickets to Michael Jackson's Bad World Tour, Margaret's eyes lit up with a fire that hadn't been there in months. "Grandma, I saved up for 6 months to get these," Lisa announced, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Front-row seats. Can you believe it?" Margaret studied the tickets carefully, her weathered fingers tracing the edges. "Lisa, honey, look at me. I can barely make it to the bathroom without help. How am I supposed to go to Madison Square Garden?" But Lisa had already thought this through. "Grandma, remember all those stories you told me about dancing with Grandpa Robert? How you two would dance to music at the neighborhood hall every Friday night? You said music made everything better." Margaret's face softened at the mention of her late husband. Robert Johnson had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind 50 years of memories and a granddaughter who needed raising. Margaret had stepped up without question, but lately the weight of responsibility felt heavier than her aging body could bear. "That was different, sweetheart. Robert and I were young then. I was strong." "You're still strong, Grandma. You raised me after Mom and Dad died. You worked 2 jobs until you were 75. You taught me how to be tough." Margaret looked at her granddaughter's hopeful face and felt her resolve weakening. Lisa had sacrificed so much to care for her. The girl had turned down college acceptance letters to stay home and help. The least Margaret could do was try to share this moment with her. "What if I fall? What if my hands start shaking during the concert? What if—" "Grandma, stop." Lisa knelt beside the wheelchair and took Margaret's trembling hands. "We'll figure it out together. We always do." But Margaret didn't know yet that this night would become the most special moment of her entire life. The next evening, getting to Madison Square Garden proved more challenging than either of them had anticipated. The subway wheelchair access was broken, forcing them to take an expensive taxi through Manhattan traffic. Margaret insisted on wearing her best dress, a navy blue number she'd worn to Robert's funeral, and her small pearl earrings. "I look ridiculous," Margaret muttered as Lisa helped secure her wheelchair in the cab. "You look beautiful, Grandma. Grandpa Robert would be so proud." As their taxi crawled through midtown traffic, Margaret found herself thinking about Robert more than usual. He'd been the one who first introduced her to music, taking her dancing at the local hall when they were just teenagers in the 1950s. Even after they married and moved to Queens, Friday nights were sacred. They'd put on records and dance in their tiny living room, Margaret's head against Robert's chest, feeling his heartbeat match the rhythm of whatever song was playing. "Lisa, honey," Margaret said suddenly, "your grandpa loved music, especially the new stuff that came out when he was older. He said Michael Jackson reminded him of the energy we had when we were young." Lisa smiled. "Really? Grandpa liked Michael Jackson?" "Oh, yes. He used to say that boy could move like nobody's business. Used to try to do that moonwalk thing in our kitchen." Margaret chuckled at the memory. "Nearly broke his hip trying." They were halfway to the garden when Margaret suddenly grabbed Lisa's arm. "What if this is too much excitement for my heart? What if the music is too loud? What if—" "Grandma, breathe. We can leave anytime you want. But let's just try, okay? For Grandpa Robert. For us." Margaret nodded, though her anxiety was building. She hadn't been in a crowd this large since Robert's funeral. The thought of 20,000 people all around her was overwhelming. But looking at Lisa's excited face, she knew she had to try. When they finally arrived at Madison Square Garden, the energy was absolutely electric. The wheelchair-accessible entrance was crowded with fans of all ages. But Margaret was surprised to see several other elderly concertgoers. A Korean War veteran named Frank struck up a conversation while they waited in line. "First Michael Jackson concert?" he asked Margaret. "Probably my last everything concert," Margaret replied honestly. Frank laughed. "That's what I said about the last 5 concerts I've been to." Music keeps us young, Mrs. Johnson, Margaret Johnson. This is my granddaughter, Lisa. Well, Mrs. Johnson, you're in for quite a show. This kid puts on the best performance I've ever seen, and I've seen them all. As they made their way to their seats in the wheelchair-accessible section, right at the front of the stage, Margaret felt some of her anxiety melting away. The other fans were friendly, excited, but not overwhelming. Lisa helped her get comfortable, making sure she had her medications and water bottle within reach. "Oh my goodness, Lisa," Margaret whispered as she looked around the massive arena. "Look at all these people. Look how happy everyone is." The lights dimmed, and Margaret felt her heart start to race. Not from anxiety this time, but from genuine excitement. She hadn't felt this anticipatory in years. When the opening notes of "Wanna Be Startin' Something" filled the arena, the crowd erupted in cheers that Margaret felt in her chest. Then Michael Jackson appeared on stage. Margaret had seen him on television countless times, but seeing him perform live was something entirely different. He moved with a grace and energy that seemed impossible, spinning and gliding across the stage like he was defying gravity itself. His voice was pure and powerful, filling every corner of the massive arena. "Oh my, Lisa, he's just like on TV, but better," Margaret said, her eyes wide with wonder. For the first hour of the concert, Margaret forgot about her Parkinson's, forgot about her wheelchair, forgot about everything except the magic happening on stage. She found herself singing along to songs she didn't even realize she knew, her small voice completely lost in the roar of 20,000 people, but her joy visible to anyone who looked at her. Lisa kept checking on her grandmother, amazed at the transformation. Margaret looked more alive than she had in months. Her eyes were bright, her face was flushed with excitement, and for moments at a time, her hands stopped trembling entirely. "This is the best night of my whole life, Lisa," Margaret whispered during a brief costume change break, her eyes shining with pure happiness. Lisa fought back tears, knowing this might be one of Margaret's last truly joyful moments. The Parkinson's was progressing quickly, and the doctors had been preparing them for harder days ahead. When Michael Jackson walked to the front of the stage to perform "Man in the Mirror," something magical happened. As he sang about making changes and looking at yourself, his eyes swept across the front row, connecting with fans. His gaze paused when it reached Margaret, but Margaret didn't notice Michael looking at her yet. She was completely lost in the music, swaying slightly in her wheelchair, her weathered hands keeping time with the beat. To Michael, she looked exactly like his beloved grandmother, Catherine's mother, who had passed away just 2 years earlier. Michael continued singing, but he couldn't stop glancing at the elegant, elderly woman in the front row. There was something about her dignity, her obvious joy, and the way the young girl beside her was watching her with such love and concern. During the song's bridge, Michael made a subtle gesture to his security team, pointing toward Margaret's section. But the real magic was just beginning. When Michael Jackson stepped into the opening beats of "The Way You Make Me Feel," the crowd went absolutely wild. This was one of his biggest hits, and the energy in Madison Square Garden reached a fever pitch. Margaret was singing along, her small voice blending with thousands of others, when something unprecedented happened. Michael stopped singing mid-verse. He walked to the very edge of the stage, looking directly at Margaret, and spoke into his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to bear with me for just a moment." The massive crowd gradually quieted, confused but respectful. Margaret looked around, wondering what was happening. "I see a beautiful lady in the front row," Michael continued, his voice gentle but carrying clearly through the arena's sound system, "who reminds me so much of my grandmother. Ma'am, in the wheelchair there, what's your name?" Margaret's eyes went wide as she realized Michael Jackson was talking to her. Lisa grabbed her grandmother's hand, both of them in shock. "Me?" Margaret called out, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Yes, ma'am, you. What's your name?" "Margaret Johnson," she managed to say loudly enough for the microphone to pick up. "Mrs. Johnson, how old are you?" 82 years old." The crowd cheered appreciatively. Michael smiled that brilliant smile that had charmed the world. "Mrs. Johnson, I bet you've got some great dance moves. Am I right?" Margaret blushed deeply. "Oh, honey, I used to. My late husband, Robert, and we danced every Friday night for 30 years. But that was a long time ago." Would you do me the honor of joining me on stage for this song? I promise I'll take good care of you." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Margaret looked terrified. "Oh no, I couldn't. I can't walk very well anymore. I have Parkinson's disease." Michael's expression became even more gentle. "Mrs. Johnson, you don't need to walk to dance with me. Will you trust me?" Lisa was crying now, squeezing her grandmother's hand. "Grandma, say yes. Say yes." Margaret looked at her granddaughter's tear-filled eyes, then at Michael Jackson himself asking her to dance, then at 20,000 people all focused entirely on her. In that moment, she felt Robert's presence as strongly as if he were standing right beside her. "For my Robert," she whispered, then called out louder, "Yes, yes, I'll dance with you." What happened next had never been done before in the history of major stadium concerts. Michael's security team carefully escorted Margaret and her wheelchair up a special ramp that led directly to the stage. The crowd watched in respectful silence as the 82-year-old woman was helped onto the stage of Madison Square Garden. When Michael Jackson walked over to Margaret and gently helped her stand from her wheelchair, 20,000 people held their breath. Margaret's legs were shaky, her hands were trembling more than usual, but Michael was right there, supporting her with gentle, strong hands. "Take your time, beautiful," Michael said softly into his microphone. "We've got all night." Margaret steadied herself, looked out at the sea of faces all focused on her, and felt a surge of strength she hadn't experienced in months. "This is for Robert," she whispered to Michael. Michael nodded and began singing "The Way You Make Me Feel" again, but slower, more gently, turning it into something like a lullaby. As he sang, he began to slowly sway back and forth, guiding Margaret's movements. Margaret, despite her Parkinson's, despite her age, despite everything she was going through, began to dance. Her movements were small, careful, but they were dancing. The sight of Michael Jackson's slow dancing with an 82-year-old grandmother on the Madison Square Garden stage was so beautiful, so unexpected, so pure, that there wasn't a dry eye in the entire arena. But something even more incredible happened. As they danced, Margaret's Parkinson's tremors seemed to subside. The music, the adrenaline, the pure joy of the moment appeared to give her a temporary reprieve from her symptoms. She was moving with more grace than she had in months. "You're a beautiful dancer, Mrs. Johnson," Michael said into his microphone as they swayed together. "You remind me of my Robert," Margaret replied, her voice picked up by Michael's mic. "He would have loved this. He would have loved you." The crowd was now openly weeping. 20,000 people watching an elderly woman with Parkinson's disease dancing with the king of pop, talking about her late husband, living what was clearly one of the most joyful moments of her life. Michael sang the entire song with Margaret. Their slow dance continued as cameras captured every precious moment. When the song ended, Michael helped Margaret back to her wheelchair. But before she sat down, she did something that surprised everyone. She reached into her small purse and pulled out a faded photograph. "This is my Robert," she said, showing Michael the picture of a handsome young man in a factory worker's uniform. "He passed 3 years ago. I carry this everywhere." Michael took the photo gently, looked at it, and then spoke into his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Robert Johnson. He was Margaret's dancing partner for 30 years, and I have a feeling he was watching us tonight." The arena erupted in the most emotional applause anyone had ever heard at a concert. Michael carefully placed the photo back in Margaret's hands and helped her into her wheelchair. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "you've made this the most special show of my entire career. Thank you for dancing with me tonight." As Margaret was helped back to her seat, Michael finished the concert with an energy and emotion that seemed even more powerful than usual. Every song seemed to be dedicated to the elderly woman who was now back in her granddaughter's loving arms. After the show, something even more remarkable happened. Michael's security team approached Margaret and Lisa with an invitation to visit Michael backstage. In his dressing room, Michael spent 30 minutes talking with Margaret about Robert, about dancing, about life. He gave her one of his signature gloves and signed a photograph. "To Margaret and Robert, dance partners forever. Love, Michael Jackson." But the most incredible part of this story was what happened after that magical night. Margaret Johnson didn't fade away quietly after her moment of fame. Something about that evening, Whether it was the excitement, the love she felt from 20,000 strangers, or just the power of having her spirits lifted so dramatically seemed to give Margaret a surge of energy and purpose that her doctors couldn't explain. The Parkinson's symptoms that had been progressing rapidly began to stabilize. Margaret started physical therapy again, motivated by the memory of dancing with Michael. She began going out more, visiting senior centers, telling her story to other elderly people who were struggling with illness or depression. That night reminded me that I'm not just someone who's sick, Margaret would tell audiences at community centers across Queens. I'm someone who danced with Michael Jackson. I'm someone who felt 20,000 people cheering for me. I'm someone who made my late husband proud. Lisa watched her grandmother transform from a woman who was quietly giving up to a woman who had found purpose again. Margaret lived for 4 more years after that concert, 4 years that her doctors had said were medically unlikely given the progression of her Parkinson's. During those 4 years, Margaret became a local celebrity in Queens. She was invited to speak at senior centers, appeared on local television shows, and became an advocate for elderly people with degenerative diseases. She always carried that signed photograph from Michael Jackson and the story of their dance. Margaret established relationships with other elderly Michael Jackson fans and attended 2 more of his concerts, always in the front row wheelchair section, always treated with special care by Michael's staff, who remembered the grandmother who had stolen the King of Pop's heart. When Margaret Johnson finally passed away peacefully in 1992, she was wearing a locket with Robert's photograph and holding the glove Michael Jackson had given her that magical night at Madison Square Garden. Lisa found a letter Margaret had written to be read after her death. The letter read, "To my beautiful granddaughter Lisa, thank you for giving me the greatest gift anyone could give. One more dance with love." That night with Michael Jackson wasn't just a concert. It was a reminder that magic exists when we're brave enough to say yes to joy. Take care of that signed photograph. Remember that your Grandpa Robert and I are dancing together again, somewhere where arthritis and Parkinson's don't exist, somewhere where the music never stops. Love always, Grandma Margaret. The experience with Margaret Johnson changed Michael Jackson profoundly as well. From that night forward, Michael made it a point to connect with elderly fans at his concerts. Not always as dramatic, every major artist who plays Madison Square Garden sees that plaque, and many ask about the story behind it. When they hear about Michael and Margaret, something changes in how they view their elderly fans. Because the story of that September night reminds all of us that we never know who's in our audience. We never know who needs a moment of magic, a touch of joy, or just the knowledge that they're seen and valued. Michael Jackson stopped his show for Margaret Johnson. But really, Margaret Johnson saved Michael's show by reminding him and all of us what performing is really about. It's not about the lights, the screaming, or the applause. It's about the connection between human beings. It's about using whatever gifts we have to make someone else's life a little brighter. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it's about giving an 82-year-old grandmother with Parkinson's disease the strength to dance again by showing her that she is loved by 20,000 strangers and the King of Pop himself. If this incredible story of dignity, courage, and human connection moved you, remember that every elderly person you meet has danced through decades of joy and sorrow. Every grandmother in a wheelchair once danced on strong legs with someone she loved. Every grandfather struggling with illness once moved with grace and purpose. The magic that happened between Michael Jackson and Margaret Johnson that night wasn't just about celebrity kindness. It was about recognizing the inherent worth and beauty in every person, regardless of age, illness, or limitation. It was about understanding that our elders carry within them lifetimes of love, loss, strength, and wisdom. Margaret Johnson asked nothing more than to sit quietly in her wheelchair and watch Michael Jackson perform. What she got was a reminder that she was still worthy of being celebrated, still capable of bringing joy to others, still deserving of having her dreams come true. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is the chance to feel special, valued, and loved. Michael Jackson gave that gift to Margaret Johnson on a September night in 1988, and Margaret, in accepting that gift with grace and courage, gave the same gift to 20,000 strangers who witnessed their magical dance. In a world that often overlooks the elderly, dismisses the disabled, and moves too fast to notice individual stories, The tale of Margaret Johnson and Michael Jackson shines like a beacon of hope. It reminds us that every person has value, every story matters, and every moment offers the possibility for magic if we're brave enough to say yes when life offers us an unexpected dance.